This topic is going to be privacy and cybersecurity, and also the surveillance ordinance, and how that relates to the citizens of Seattle and what that means going forward for the city. It's also set in the backdrop of Portland adopting its own privacy resolutions and San Francisco recently passing a ban on facial recognition by use of the city. So I would like to introduce my panelists one by one, starting on my left, and I'll refer to my notes so I don't get anything wrong. To my left, we have Ginger Armbruster. She's the Chief Privacy Officer of the City of Seattle and was previously the city's Privacy Program Manager, which she was leading the effort to create the privacy principles that are in place in the city today. Going down the row, we have Mike Katell, who's a PhD candidate and lecturer at the University of Washington, and he has an expertise in information ethics and tech policy. Then we have Sara Bromling, who is a project manager at Rubica, a company that provides enterprise-level cybersecurity services directly to consumers. And at the end, we have Camille Malonzo. She's a software engineer at Microsoft and an engaged citizen who's been actively involved with CTAB and contributed to work on the surveillance ordinance. Public comment. So please welcome all of the panelists. And Ginger and I will have to share a microphone. So to start it off, we're going to begin on privacy policies, what they mean, what the city has in place. And I'd like to start with Camille and ask, what does privacy protection mean to you? And what privacy concerns do you have as a resident in a major metropolitan area like Seattle?
So going back to the question, what does privacy protection mean to you, and what does privacy protection mean in the context of Seattle or a major metropolitan area? I think I first think about what kind of data institutions might have on me individually as well as communities, and what kind of controls to kind of manage, access, maybe even delete that kind of data. And I think what's kind of frustrating as a citizen is sometimes you don't know what that may be across institutions. I think we can think about it as like that kind of data in the private sector, kind of consumer data, and the kind of controls that individual companies are implementing to have more access to that data. But I think increasingly when we read articles or just have an increased public discourse about how technology and data impacts so many parts of our lives, we have a higher expectation for all institutions to share with us what that data may be. And so that kind of comes up in different areas, but I think specifically when it comes to the city or metropolitan areas or kind of urban spaces, I think about specific areas like policing and how that impacts different communities in our area. I think about all the articles that come up about licenses. I think in July there was an article about how ICE is going through our licenses to find immigrants, and that's one, traumatizing for the immigrant community as well as really impactful for just like all of us all up. And then I think the third thing is I think about the ways in which the Seattle community, and I think Ginger's going to speak to this, how we kind of speak to those frustrations and concerns. We have our privacy policy and all of the work that Ginger's team does, but how else can we kind of have that accessible for all of our community members?
Great, thank you. The next question follows that and is for Ginger. And Seattle was one of the first cities in the US to adopt strong privacy policies. If you go to the seattle.gov website, you'll be able to see in the privacy information area that we have privacy principles, a privacy policy, and a privacy statement. Can you let us know what the differences are between those and what they mean for us?
I would be happy to. Can I take first a couple minutes and kind of describe how Seattle got to all those? Something of a story, and I don't know who's been here from the beginning, but in 2015, the CTO, Chief Technology Officer of the city, was tasked with doing something to build public trust about the data we collect. And this came out of a few different technologies that became noticeable, that the privacy community became concerned about. One was a camera that was put on the waterfront, series of cameras for infrastructure protection, and some of those cameras were looking into people's apartments. Inadvertently, was not on purpose. Doesn't really matter. There was a wireless mesh network that was designed for first responders to be able to connect directly into and be able to continue to communicate before they were out of the bay. So there's a period of time and a space where folks were having a hard time connecting. It did other things as well, but people were concerned that they were identifying their phones as they walked down the street to some of these nodes. And the final one, which I think was probably the clincher, was the Seattle Police Department, in their enthusiasm, flew a drone in council chambers to demonstrate this wonderful new technology that could be used for a variety of purposes, all leading people to say, okay, you know, we've been collecting data for quite a long time, but technology is moving apace. We need to address the fact that we're collecting a lot of information. So the mayor and the council came to the CTO and said, you need to do something about data and public trust and how we manage this. So I was the person at the time for this, and we worked with an external advisory board and an internal board to come up with what would a privacy program look like for a city. And we landed on the idea that we should start with a set of principles. We should start with what we stand for, and this should have public input. This should come from some experts in the field, private sector, academia. We had the ACLU participate. We had Seattle Times. They're very interested in public records. That's how they do their work. I can't think of any. We had private sector, I mentioned. We had federal prosecutors with experience in the federal side and drone programs. So we had all these folks come together, and we came up with a set of privacy principles, and there are 6 of them, and they speak to acknowledging the importance of information, that we understand this is valuable and important. We speak to being clear about notice and content, all the way to security of data. So there's 6 of these. I won't enumerate them right now, but those were the privacy principles, and that set the framework for what it is important to the city. And from there, we developed a privacy program, and that meant now we need a privacy statement. We always had an online statement, but now we need to address all the ways we collect data and what we're going to do with that information. So we updated our privacy statement, which is the outward-facing commitments for the folks in the city who interact with us electronically and other ways, to say this is what we're doing, we're giving you clear notice, here's what we do and do not do, so that's available. And then finally, the privacy policy, a little different than maybe what we're envisioning from a outward-facing document. This is inward-facing to the city to say, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to review the stuff we bring on board. We're going to follow these principles. Every new project, every new acquisition, we're going to be following these privacy principles to make sure that we're living up to our commitments to the city. There are 4 of us on my team now to make sure that happens. We have a review process so that we are part of the gating process, so any new technology that's non-standard gets to get a review. Any new project goes through a variety of what we call stage gates, kind of places where we stop for a minute and say, how are we doing on this? Are we spending the money the way we should? And do we have privacy in place? So that's what I oversee, in addition to surveillance, which we'll pick up in just a minute. But each of those components of a privacy program are important in delivering the final hopeful product, which is we're managing and stewarding information the way we said we would. So for us, privacy is about the commitments we make to the public. And personal information is really anything that can be linked or linkable to an identifiable individual. So aside from the idea that, yes, we collect social security numbers and we collect your location and we collect whatever it is you need to do to permit your dog, all those things, anything that can be linked or linkable to an individual we take under the umbrella of the privacy program, with the understanding, as we all should know, we have a Public Records Act that makes it very difficult for us to actually protect information if it is requested by somebody through a public record. So a lot of our effort is around minimizing collection and being very clear to people about what could or could not happen to the information that we collect. Hopefully that answers some of that. That was very long. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, I actually just had kind of a follow-up question. As I understand it, you were involved with the Portland privacy principles. Could you sort of elaborate on what you were up to there?
Yeah, so I came back to the city. I was a program manager building these principles, did all that work, and then I went off to private industry because I wanted to understand what is it that's going on in the consumer data world that's coming back to the city. So a lot of people are going off getting that experience and coming back to us with all kinds of great ideas. I wanted to understand that better. So I went to Microsoft for a couple of years, came back, and the question was? Portland. So what I found almost immediately in the 2 years that I'd been gone, my brain is also gone. In the 2 years that I've been gone, is that many other cities, states, municipalities were having the same experience we had had. You know, public wants to know how data is being used. We have those expectations in the private sector. Europe is taking great strides in consumer data protection. All these cities and states suddenly wanted to start their own program, and I started getting phone calls. We started getting a lot of phone calls, and Portland was one of them. And I went down for a day, and we spent time together with kind of their information folks, data folks, information equity folks, people interested in data equity. And we worked on their set of principles. They came from a slightly different perspective. I think ours was a little more surveillance-oriented and concerns about surveillance technologies. Theirs came from kind of a data equity perspective. Every city has their different intersection. They all kind of end up in the same place, but that's what that was. I've also had consultations with San Jose. San Francisco wanted me to take a look at their facial recognition legislation just to get a perspective for somebody who's been doing this for a while. Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., the city of probably 10, 15 different cities are working on similar projects. And so not that we have all the answers, it's just we've kind of plowed that road so we can give them ideas about what has worked and what hasn't and things to think about. And the thing I tell all of them is start with principles. Start with what you can all agree on. We can all agree on some things that are pretty basic in terms of your rights around data. It gets more complicated when you get into the details about how you're going to run that. So it was a great experience with Portland. We continue to collaborate, and we have a, through the Future for Privacy Forum, we have a monthly conversation, which I think there's probably 30 or 40 people now on this call, all sharing information about what are you doing, what's working, what are you hearing, what's successful with your elected folks, what's working for public engagement. We're all trying to collaborate and come up with best practices in an area that's absolutely brand new. We just are forging new territory, and it's different than private sector. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this sort of dovetails into one concern, which is that if you live in Seattle, you might have a very strong privacy policy or privacy principles that protect you as an individual and your data. But if you go outside city limits, the next city over might have a different set of privacy principles that are less strong, or just prioritize, like you said, digital equity versus a surveillance mindset. So this next question is for Mike, and it has to do with what efforts are being made at the state level, the state of Washington level, that are also addressing privacy concerns and might provide some more consistent privacy protections across the state of Washington.
Yeah, thanks, Torgie. So there's been a lot of activity at the state level in Washington, and even at the state level, we have the challenge of, even if we pass progressive legislation in the state of Washington, there's still the states of Idaho, Montana, Oregon, California, et cetera, in every direction. So I just want to clarify something, that passing something at the state level is certainly better than only having municipal privacy regulation, which at the moment, for the most part, in the U.S., that's what we've got. We haven't passed any federal privacy legislation in the U.S. Of any substantive manner, or at least in any way that actually protects privacy, since 1986 with the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, right? Which at the time was a very forward-looking piece of legislation, but it was almost immediately obsolete. And so that's where we are at the federal level. And as anybody who knows anything about the politics of state, local, and federal law understands, that all solutions that are really that work at a fundamental level, that actually protect people in a sweeping way, they have to be larger than local rules and regulations. We see the same problem, say, for example, with homelessness. We provide services for the homeless in one city, but they're not provided in another city. Then people move around, and then you have charges of creating, a safe haven or something like that, absurd stuff, for homeless folks. But it does point to the fact that the reality is, if you're going to have policies that affect large numbers of people, they need to be regional, national, or international solutions. So here at the state of, probably in response to the progressive policies that have been passed within the city of Seattle, there have been efforts in the Washington State legislature that have been very promising. In particular, there was a comprehensive privacy bill that was offered and failed in the legislature last session, that in some ways mirrors some very promising legislation that was passed in California that goes into effect in January, the California Consumer Privacy Act. which offers a range of data protections for consumers in the state of Washington. There's a good chance that a version of that bill will be, we know we're pretty likely going to see one be reintroduced, and it's a good possibility we'll pass something. Certainly there's a certain amount of momentum happening from other states, just like the surveillance ordinance in Seattle has joined with surveillance ordinances in other municipalities to create momentum in other municipalities to do similar things. Another bill that was particularly progressive that was offered in the state in the state legislature that I believe is quite remarkable and unique in the country was House Bill 1654, which was a moratorium. The original bill offered a moratorium on facial recognition technology used by state actors. And this is really important for those of you who are familiar with facial recognition. It's the technology for identifying people based on their facial features. There are speculative uses of facial recognition that go much farther than trying to identify people, to actually trying to determine things about them, like detecting their state of mind, their mood. Most of that type of technology is facetious at the moment and years away if possible. But the identification piece is very much in place. And facial recognition technology is particularly, well, I'll say dangerous. It's a very dangerous technology. And it has two sources of danger. One is the danger of its inaccuracy. It is a woefully imperfect technology, and it is unlikely to ever become perfect. It is particularly bad at identifying women and people of color and young people. And it's been tested over and over again and shown that white people are much more likely to be positively identified than darker skinned people, women, and children. And the problem with misidentification is you can simply imagine a scenario in which somebody is wrongly suspected of being perhaps violent. Facial recognition, imagine a scenario in which a police officer is wearing a body-worn camera, the camera triggers and says, this person is wanted for an assault on a police officer. Weapons are drawn, words are exchanged, the possibility of violence is quite immediate. Right? But even if facial recognition technology were perfect, even if it worked perfectly all the time, it could identify anybody, anywhere, at any time, you have to ask yourself, do you want to live in a society in which camera, and it can be applied to any type of camera or footage, so that would you want to live in a city in which any camera on any street corner was able to identify you, the people you were with, was able to pick your face out of a political protest, or to identify you entering or exiting a mosque, a synagogue, or a social club. In this way, facial recognition is a incredibly powerful technology, and so placing restraints on it seems quite reasonable. And that's one of the bills that I believe is also likely to be reintroduced at the state level, and it would solve some of the problem of having. Right now, the cities and other jurisdictions, smaller jurisdictions, carrying the weight of reasonable surveillance and data and privacy and policies, which is where we're at now. I mean, I think there's very little else going on in the country. Ginger probably knows more about this, about what's happening in other states and other cities. I know that Illinois has that biometric identification bill that is now landed Facebook in court over their violation of that. But there's very little legislation that is sweeping, and it's probably going to be a long time before we see anything happening at the federal level. And so these efforts happening at the state level and certainly also at the city level are probably our most, that's where we can place the most optimism in regulating these kinds of technologies.
That's a great overview, Mike, of what's going on out there. I thought I might add just a couple of things. If you were concerned about what's happening in the city does not employ in any way facial recognition. One time we had technology that was limited to trying to identify folks who had been booked into different jails, and we had several different counties that were involved in using that as one way to identify somebody if we didn't have a positive identification. We haven't used that technology in 2 or 3 years, so just thought I'd add that from the city perspective. Does not talk to every other city, but that's one thing. The other thing that I did participate in a session about facial recognition, and it was a forum back east, and we were speaking about the technology, and I think the thing that does us the least good are all the shows and movies that show all the amazing things, facial recognition technology. It doesn't do that. It can't fill in shadows. It can't fill in half a face that's not there. But I think it's the future of that technology that we're all concerned about and how it can be used or misused. So it's definitely front and center, I think, for a lot of concern. I just wanted to let you all know that's something we don't do at the city. Don't concern yourself with that, or be concerned, but know that that's not what we're doing. It also is a technology that only works face on. So as I was at this forum, the driver's licenses become the best use, or social media. So your wonderful smiling face on your social media page are the best images for that reason, that you just can't get an oblique view. Anyway, sorry, it's a little technical, but I wanted to let you know that.
And it's actually really interesting that the city had the booking photo comparison software, which was on the master list, right? But now has decided not to use that technology. But the city doesn't actually have a ban on facial recognition per se, but it would be subject to the surveillance ordinance, presumably as a surveillance technology if it were introduced. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Does anyone else have any thoughts on facial recognition or state level legislation? Okay. So we've talked a lot about privacy policies in the context of a municipality or like in the civic space. So I want to transition a little bit and talk about what a privacy policy does for you in the private sector. And so this question is for Sara. Rubica has an extremely strict privacy policy and data sharing policy. So how does Rubica's privacy policy differ from what you might find typically when you're signing up for a service? And what do you feel most consumers out there agree to without realizing they're agreeing to it?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Little
Closer? How about now? Yeah? Okay. I'd say generally most privacy policies are pretty loose in how they protect user data, and probably even weaker when it comes to who and how they're sharing that data with, particularly when it comes to third-party vendors or advertising partners. Particularly at Rubica, we sell security to our clients. So in essence, what that means is we're selling trust. And part of that, we had a lot of discussion around this, but we decided literally to put our money where our mouth is. And in our terms of agreement, we explicitly lay out we will never sell your data guarantee to our clients. Even going as far as to say that we would pay our clients up to 3 times as much as we have received for that data. But regardless, we adhere to a strict, we will never sell our clients' data. As far as what you may or may not be aware of agreeing to, the first thing that really pops into mind is advertising partnerships and what that looks like. And when you think of free services out there, that may be from the games that you play to the email services that you subscribe to a mortgage calculator. Any free service truly isn't free. What's happening behind the scenes is that they're gathering and they're selling your data. And that includes some of those free security products out there. Some of the free VPN services. The concept behind a VPN is that you are protecting your privacy by using this technology. And at Rubica, we think it's completely unethical to then go around and sell what we're telling our customers that we're protecting. So in essence, I'd say that as a company, we have a pretty strict stance that we believe that digital privacy should be a priority and democratized across sectors.
Great, thank you. Sort of following that, this is a question for anyone who has a thought on this or wants to chime in. We've been talking about the ways that outside organizations or companies or cities, municipalities are promising certain protections through privacy policies and data sharing policies. But beyond trusting those policies, what can an individual do to protect their data from being collected and shared online, either from a private company or from the city?
I could chime in really quick. first thing that pops into my mind is due diligence. Right now, we don't have any, well, I wouldn't say any, but there's a real lack of legislation and regulation around data privacy. So I say doing a due diligence when you're downloading an app, for instance, just taking that extra time to what permissions are you truly granting that app, and just being really cognizant that data is now a commodity and it's yours, and you have a right to know what that data is being used for.
I think right on about reading those very tedious online privacy statements, and I think that's actually an issue right now. Probably in academia, what is the concept of informed consent? So when you check that box, do you really understand what you're doing? Probably not. So the industries are trying to take this issue on seriously, and I think there will be legislation around what that means.
Yeah, so far a couple of things. The short answer to your question is there's not a lot you can do unless you're willing to do a great deal of work, right? And even then, it's pretty hard to protect your privacy. And it's difficult for people to make that decision on a daily basis because for most of us, an individual gift of information about ourselves, it doesn't feel like it costs anything. Giving up my location, using my phone and all the ways it tracks me, it doesn't feel like it's harming me in any particular way, right? And it only, and it might become more, I might be more sensitive to it if I say it was, let's say I was involved in some political organizing that was extraordinarily unpopular or could run afoul of particularly powerful people who happen to be very paranoid and are in the White House right now. These are the kind. In that case, I would of course be much more motivated to do the work. But for an average person just leading their lives, it feels overwhelming. In fact, what I hear mainly from students, the young people you're talking about, and these are people who are just sort of becoming really aware. People who are like in 18 to 22, they're becoming much more sophisticated about these issues, but they're still coming out of a sort of a denial phase of paying any attention. And the first response is resignation. And I don't think it's just, and I don't think that young people are the only people who resigned. I think a lot of us in this room can relate to this feeling of like, what can I do? And I can tell you, as a scholar who researches this stuff, there's more data being collected about you than you know, in more places and at more times. And there are more ways of collecting data about you coming any moment now. So pretty soon, lots of airports are going to be employing facial recognition at check-in to get on a plane. Just read a thing today about how baseball stadiums are going to start using cashierless checkout the way Amazon does, which means they're going to have to scan you. There's already things that many of you probably are aware of, in which if you go into stores, and particularly chain stores, and you have your Wi-Fi on your phone, you're being tracked, and your location in the store is being closely monitored so they can tell what kinds of things are interesting to you and so on. But of course, the more you think about these things, the crazier you're likely to get. And so at some point you have to make a deal with yourself, right? And just decide that, that what you can live with. But one thing, some of the things, the basic things you can do is that you can just be very aware. What Ginger said is like reading about what's happening, thinking about what the app is doing. A colleague today at the University of Washington just told me about a teaching tool or teaching technique she's going to try with her students this quarter, in which she's going to do something called the walkthrough method, in which she's going to have people look at various apps and just walk through them. And just try, first of all, of course, reading the various policies, but going beyond that, looking at how the app works. What kind of information is it collecting? What is the experience it's trying to provide? What is required in order to provide that experience, right? And what value does the app maker get out of providing that experience to you, especially if they're doing it for free? And by doing this is essentially just advice to just slow down in our use of all these tools and conveniences, and to be more thoughtful and, dare I say, mindful about how we use these and what kinds of burden we're willing to take on. But truly, the question is actually a little bit problematic in one way, because at the end of the day, the real injustice is that it's actually up to us to protect ourselves against something that really shouldn't be this chaotic and Wild West as it is. I mean, the absence of any meaningful regulation, particularly at the federal level, is actually a scandal, right? Even the GDPR in Europe, a very progressive piece of legislation, has gigantic holes carved into it to enable these very successful information and data businesses to go as unhindered as possible into their work, as if this was the only way we could organize society, the only way we could organize our economies, was by just opening the floodgates and leaving individuals and groups open to relentless surveillance.
We could talk for hours. Good stuff. One of the things I think that's important to do is to decide what's important to you. And I think if I were to give you just a few things to think about, the kinds of data that's collected either by app or by proximity or using your online computer, your personal privacy of your body, and expectation that your body's your own. If I go into the restroom, nobody's taking pictures. Credentials, online credentials, privacy of that, banking information, and location, just those. And to think to yourself, if I had to choose 1, 2, 3, 4, which one would come up to the top? I might suggest to you that you may not be aware of this, but location data, when it's collected, is usually to 4 or 6 decimal points. 4 decimal points gets you within 30 to 20 feet. 6 decimal points is within like 6 inches. So the data that's collected about location isn't that you're at the corner of, 2nd and Cherry. It's you are exactly here in the world. It's an XY coordinate. It's longitude and latitude, and it knows exactly where you are. So when you turn on your location services, that's what it's doing. And those pixels that may be on a website, that's what it's collecting to that kind of level. So you may really want to be thoughtful about what's most important to you. Right now, location data is super hot. This is like everybody wants to know where you are. They want to know where you are so they can feed you ads and they can know where you're going to be next. They can make inferences about you. When you rent a scooter in a city or you rent one of our bike share things, that's one of the pieces of information that's collected. The city likes that information because we want to build the infrastructure that we need for those different modalities. Marketing companies like that information because they want to know who you are and they start building this idea about who you are. And the facial recognition thing that worries me a lot is not how governments are using it, because I don't think they really are quite yet. Enforcement certainly, but what worries me is about the consumer data that's collected. My daughter went to campfire camp, and one of the first emails I got was, hey, sign up for facial recognition, send us a picture of your kid, and we'll just feed you the pictures we take during the week of just her. And I'm thinking, what? And I had to get on my soapbox and call people, and what do you think you're doing in facial recognition? Because what it does is it's building a profile of a small kid who didn't really have any choice in the matter, right? And we don't know what that company's going to do with that data down the road, so they may have a purpose for it now, but now it's just collected. I didn't do it, by the way. Told everybody else not to do it too, but anyway. So those are the things to be thoughtful about. What's most important to you, and be mindful especially for that. Location is something you should be super aware of. Just people knowing where you are and where you go, because you do that probably on a regular basis, and your commute probably looks pretty, those chariot ruts probably are pretty established about where you go and what you're doing. So I guess I would say that. It's not only the free stuff, it's everything else that's collecting information about you, and be mindful. And you do have some choices, not enough, and I'm with you. We need some federal regulation around this stuff. Part of it is, we were having this conversation, our legislators don't know enough about this, and they don't hear from people like you. And if they do hear from you, maybe it's not concentrated enough for them to see this is really important. So there's a very small cadre of people that are concerned about this issue and understand it well enough. And then I think there are a lot of people who've given up. I have people in my own office who just go, oh, Ginger. It's over, and no, it's not. It's not over. You have choices you can make about this. It does feel overwhelming, but there are some choices, and our legislators need to hear about it, that this is an important issue we want you to pursue.
No names, though.
No names.
Okay. Camille, do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah. So I just have a question. So I think what's frustrating sometimes is this idea of self-regulation, that like consumer companies can just self-regulate themselves. So I wonder what you both might have to what to say about that kind of narrative and how we can like combat that, because I guess there are some companies that try to self-regulate and kind of market themselves as having all these controls because of XYZ, but are they doing enough? Probably not, but what can we do about it? That's the question.
I mean, self-regulation is a fiction. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if you ask the wolves to self-regulate around the hen house, you will still lose hens, right? There's no question about it. That being said, that's my strongest position, is that self-regulation is self-regulation. The key word is self. It's about self-interest. So for example, the online advertising industry has for many years limited their targeted advertising up to the very edge of what they think people can tolerate. Right? So a lot of folks are concerned. They believe that the microphone on their phone that is listening to them. Like I was just talking about a trip to the Sierra Nevadas, and suddenly I saw an ad for hiking boots, or for a vacation to Sierra Nevadas, right? So we're not sure. We're still not sure. Scholars debate this, but for the most part, the belief is that no, nobody has, except for malicious actors, truly malicious actors, no mainstream technology company or mainstream advertising company, it would turn on your microphone to listen to what you were saying. They're tempted. They want to, right? And if they could do it, they're definitely having meetings in which people are arm wrestling over that issue. But they're not doing it because they know that would unleash too much hostility, right? So self-regulation means doing the worst you can do that people either won't know about or won't complain too vociferously about. Now that being said, having given you my soapbox screed on that, at the end of the day, industry does have to participate in the solution. Whether or not they do it under some sort of duress is another question. But when private principles, regulation will only go as far as the moment the ink was dry, and someone will come up with a new way to mess with you, right? And there is a lot of work happening in the design field to promote privacy protection at the level of design. There's a movement called Privacy by Design that was initiated by Ann Cavoukian, who was a former policymaker in Canada, and now is just basically, I'm not quite sure what she does except to promote this idea of privacy by design. And it does require a certain amount of good faith, extension of good faith to companies that they will actually follow through on it, but companies are adopting this idea of privacy by design as part of their brand identity to promote themselves as the good guys, right? So famously, Apple, which is not exactly a positive actor in all domains of its operations, has tried to position itself as being more privacy-centric. Microsoft, to a certain extent, has also tried to do this, for no other reason to differentiate themselves from Facebook and Google or other companies in which they're in competition. But it's a branding strategy that is promoting certain ideas. Also, it does help. I mean, as people become more aware, as things like the Edward Snowden revelations have really put the idea of privacy on the map. It's been several years now, but it really wasn't. It really was just a glimmer before those revelations happened. Industry is stepping up a little bit, and at the end of the day, a lot of the changes have to happen deep inside where the technologies are coming from in order for it to actually be real and legit. I don't think that will happen completely voluntarily. It requires a good deal of pressure from consumers and a good deal of pressure from regulators, if nothing else, of threatens of much harsher sanctions if they don't follow through.
Good question. So at this point, I think we're going to transition into talking more directly about the surveillance ordinance. So a brief history on this. This is a ordinance passed by City Council on September 1st, 2017, and it requires all city departments to identify technologies that they're using today that meet the definition of surveillance, and also for the future, any technologies that are acquired or wish to be acquired that meet this surveillance definition to be reviewed through public comment through a working group that's focused on civil liberties, and then that assessment, it was called a surveillance impact report, is given to City Council, where they can make a decision about whether to continue or not to continue or to modify the technology that's in use. So this is, I believe, very close to being one of the nation's first overall surveillance technology reviews. And over the course of these 2 years, since it was brought into law, 29 technologies have been added to the master list of technologies that needed to be reviewed. And I believe we are between groups 2 and 3 right now of the review process. They're being batched up into groups, released to the public for comment. That goes for a month. Comment is then collected and then passed on to City Council. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this surveillance ordinance. And I'll find my piece of paper here. This is sort of a general question for everyone again. The surveillance technology criteria says that technology whose primary purpose is to observe or analyze the movements, behavior, or actions of identifiable individuals in a manner that is reasonably likely to raise concern about civil liberties, freedom of speech or association, racial equity, or social justice. Identifiable individuals also include individuals whose identity can be revealed by license plate data when combined with any other record. So that's the base definition of surveillance. When a technology matches that definition, it then goes on to a second step where it needs to meet certain inclusion criteria. And that means that the technology will be flagged for review. If it meets exclusion criteria, it means that it's exempt from review. So this is open for everyone. One of the inclusion criteria states, again, that the technology raises reasonable concerns about impacts to civil liberty, freedom of speech or association, racial equity, or social justice. So the question is, what does reasonable mean to you? And who ultimately gets to have a voice in defining what reasonable is to the city?
Can I start a little bit? Is that okay? Because I have some history on this. So yes, that is a problem. So the checklist he's looking at caused us all kind of consternation. So when this bill was made into law 2 years ago, that was our first concern, because what I may consider reasonable when I understand what the technology does may sound different to you all. So we looked through these technologies. We did a citywide audit of hundreds of things out there that could have possibly been construed to be this. Anything that monitored, analyzed, tracked identifiable individuals in a manner that could, we kind of ended there. We kind of figured almost anybody, if something's monitoring, tracking, or analyzing your behavior for an identifiable individual, is probably going to resonate to someone that's uncomfortable or could be construed, depending on what your activity is, right? If you're doing a political rally and it's something that may not be popular with established government, that may feel uncomfortable even if that wasn't the intent. Anyway, so I think this law tries to get at intent, but we took the very conservative view that we're just going to count anything that monitors, analyzes, or tracks identifiable individuals, especially around police or other kinds of enforcement. We landed on 4 different departments that had these technologies. I think in retrospect, to be very, very honest, some of these probably shouldn't be on the list. We had 3 technologies from Seattle City Light that were used for current diversion investigation, binoculars, and some metering devices that check electricity. You know, it was a little bit of a stretch to say that was surveillance, but they're used for surveillance, right, for folks that are diverting current, not using it. So I think it's really hard to do the sniff test on what feels like an invasion of civil liberties. And so for the most part, the city took a very wide interpretation of that. Just because of the disparity. That's such a hard thing to do, to try to capture the intent of something. And I think everybody who has different perspectives would have a different threshold.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The word reasonable is found in a lot of legislation, and it kind of signals the fact that our whole system of laws in the United States is really based on the idea that lawmaking is always unfinished. And the reason why so many laws wind up in court is actually not a failure of lawmaking, it's actually by design. Laws are meant to be debated in courts of law, are meant to be parsed by judges. That's why when we have the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution about search and seizure is very short. Fourth Amendment jurisprudence is millions of pages long, and that's actually where we derive a lot of our privacy protections, is in all those court cases, right? So the word reasonable really is kind of a placeholder in there, which kind of, in my opinion, means like, we're going to figure that out later, right? But what Ginger points out is true about how the city responded. I mean, the intent of the surveillance ordinance is hard to completely understand, except that a lot of it is spelled out in the very beginning of the ordinance. In a lot of in the at the city level and also at the state level and also the federal level, most bills are written with a series of proclamations of sorts at the beginning, declarations. In the city ordinances, for example, contains a number of paragraphs that begin with the word whereas, and they make basically pronouncements about what led to the creation of a particular ordinance. And one of the whereases, in particular in the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance, is actually very profound, because it actually points particularly to the fact that cities, law enforcement in particular, have a long and an unsavory history of using technology to surveil and control undesirable populations, right? And for example, in the city of Seattle and the whole west coast of the United States, for example, the Japanese internment is a good example. In the years leading up to Japanese people being interned in camps during World War II, was at least a decade, if not more, of the federal government using the technology of the day to sort, categorize, and control the Japanese population of the U.S. We see echoes of it today in the way in interest in controlling the census and in putting people in camps and so on. So the fact that that language made it into the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance is actually rather profound. And with some colleagues, I read surveillance ordinances from around the country. And Seattle and Oakland are the only ones to have included this kind of language in their ordinances, calling out this troubling history. And so I actually kind of applaud the city for this conservative approach of being over-including technologies on their master list, so that that scholars and I could or activists could look at the list and say, binoculars? Why are there binoculars on there? But it's like, well, binoculars are on there, which it sends a signal that there are probably things that aren't on there, except those things that were exempted by the ordinance. That the city's not trying to hide the stuff that it actually has and uses. So in that way, that's very positive.
I think I might want to go on. Sorry. All right. Thank you for that. That actually answered the next question I was going to ask you perfectly. So I'd like to move on and talk about the remaining inclusion criteria that only one of them needs to be met for a surveillance technology to be flagged for review. And this is a question for Sara. The remaining two inclusion criteria that haven't already been mentioned have to do with collecting personally identifiable information, and this could be information such as a name, date of birth, driver's license number, social security number, or certain combinations of disparate things that can be combined to uniquely identify this person. So one of the inclusion criteria in particular reads that if the technology has a high likelihood that personally identifiable information will be shared with non-city entities that will use the data for a purpose other than providing the city with contractually agreed upon services. And during the surveillance ordinance review, in the two groups that have been made public so far, we've learned that there are quite a few public-private partnerships or contracts that have been made with third-party vendors. So the question is, what sort of data sharing agreement would you expect to see, or that you would like to see with that kind of working relationship? And just overall, how big of a market is there for data sharing, and who might want data and why?
It's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I guess I'll start with the first part. Third-party vendors and what you might expect from that relationship, particularly I think as a relation to a government entity and a private corporation. Me personally, I would say that data is not being monetized, that data is not being sold. However, when we're talking about third-party vendors and we're talking about data breaches, Closer. So when we're talking about third-party vendors and we're talking about data breaches, they represent a pretty high number of causes for the data breaches that we do see. I think about in 2018, I think it was Best Buy, Sears, Kmart, Delta, all different companies, all hit with a data breach because they shared a third-party vendor that supported their customer support and chat services. And just as recently as June of this year, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency suffered a cyber attack due to a third-party contractor. So I've seen a lot of numbers out there, but I've seen like a range from 45 to 60% of all data breaches have resulted from a third-party vendor breach. So that is something significant to consider when we're talking about relationships, particularly with the government, with these third-party vendor agreements. So, second part, which was data and who would be interested in that.
Yeah, the market for,
yeah,
for data and information.
Well, that is an incredible market. I think I mentioned data is now a commodity. I think it was back in 2017, The Economist wrote an article talking about how oil is no longer the most valuable commodity. It's now data. Now, since then, I've seen whether that's accurate or not. There's tons of arguments back and forth, but nevertheless, data is a commodity, and it's a valuable commodity. So I think that this is pretty. It's relevant to a lot of industries and not just government.
Yeah, actually, I just want to mention, I mean, particularly, I would say everybody is interested in this data. I mean, governments collect some of the most sensitive personal data about people that there is. I mean, birth, marriage, death, right? Any kind of contact with the criminal justice, you know, for any kind of arrest, any kind of business trouble, bankruptcy. But beyond that, cities, of course, are getting to a point where they're not just involved in these transactions of your basic, you know, municipal needs. They're also, you know, cities have control over a great deal of lifestyle data just through the new forms of technology that they're employing. For example, smart electric meters, which have been recently adopted in the city of Seattle. All over the world where smart meters have been employed, there have been a number of debates about the privacy implications of what smart meters can reveal about people's lives. Rather than a meter that sits outside your house and it gets read by a meter reader once every month or two, you know, and then they just do some math, a smart meter is capable of reading your electricity usage down to every minute or more, or even you know, more frequently. The kind of information that could reveal, and I should mention that the city of Seattle uses smart meters. Their reading interval, I don't think we've settled on knowing what the reading interval is, but they've agreed. Seattle City Light has agreed not to sell the data to any third-party vendors, but that is by no means guaranteed in other places where smart meters are employed. So there's a great deal of interest because of what smart meters can potentially reveal. You reveal, at the very least, things like what time people wake up and go to sleep. But smart meters can reveal more than that. They can reveal what kinds of appliances are used in the home. It turns out that different appliances have energy use signatures that can be revealed through smart meter data, and mixed with artificial intelligence and so on, you can reveal a great deal. Now, and that's just one example, but cities are involved in all manner of collecting all types of data in new forms every day. And you know, on the one hand, we want cities to be efficient and effective, and of course, the ability to collect and use data is one of the ways in which government does its job. On the other hand, this data is very sensitive, and as Sara pointed out, I mean, it's very vulnerable. Not only do third-party vendors are you know, open to security vulnerabilities. Think about what you know about city government. Some parts of government are very well resourced and have incredibly sophisticated technologists working for them, and other parts of government do not. Other parts of government are not well resourced. They're using outdated technology. Their security is only as good as the last visit they had from the IT department and so on. And not to throw stones at Seattle, but this is true of government everywhere, right? Government only has the resources that the people give them, and they have a very finite number of them. So their ability to protect the data that they're collecting runs up against the same sort of barriers as happens in the private sector. But in the private sector, where there's a bottom line profit incentive, in many cases, security is likely to be a little stronger.
I think that data sharing also speaks to other government agencies, including federal government. And so our interpretation is not only the private-public sector issue, but also where else could this data be used secondarily without consent or without understanding. So we are very concerned about ICE action, for example, and coming after Seattle City Light invoices, and the recent story we heard out of King County. I just met with the individual who's taking on the privacy role there, and even with the law in place to say we're not going to share jail information, that got shared with ICE many, many times. And then we had a driver's license state of Washington issue. So I think the data sharing also speaks to being careful about the data we collect and it's used for the purpose in which it was intended. And it's interesting that, because I think the smart city idea, and that's coming up next, I think the next conversation. Smart city technology can be wonderful, but it's collecting even more information than we are currently doing. And so the concern about what exactly that means and what that means for the data the city collects. And I want to remind everybody too about the Public Records Act. And as wonderful as it is to have a sunshine law that means you can know what everything the government is doing, most of the data that's requested is the public's data. So every time we collect, we have to be mindful that somebody could ask for it. Please don't. But you could ask for quite a bit. And as we look at smart city technology, that becomes a super concern, because we write contracts all over the place about don't monetize, don't use it. But anyone else can just say, just give it to me. Give me all that location data you collected from all those scooter users in LA. Give me all that data you're collecting for the bike share. And we wouldn't be able to stop them. So, well, we have some contracts in place. So yes, we're trying to be smarter about it. But that's what public data requests mean. So that means that the private sector can get a hold of this stuff without asking, which is what they're doing. They're asking for it, but they're not paying for it. So there's a whole area of, I think about this late at night. I'm weird. I think about things like, well, if we're going to monetize it, why don't we do it for the good of the public, right? If it's got to be made available anyway, let's think about being mindful about doing this in a way that we can finance some things, right? I don't know if that's the right answer, but it's what I start to think about, because you can't put brakes on some of this unless we go back to the legislature and say, we know what the Sunshine Law was intending. Here's what it's kind of turned into now that all this data is collected. Is that really your intent? Do you really want to make it so that everybody who's having a bad day with the police department, suddenly all that's made available? I don't think that was really the intention exactly.
And it probably was, and it was probably never the intention for it to become an industry, right?
Yeah,
for
and
people to
I
be
think
able to collect that information and then profit handsomely from it.
I think the idea was, if the government's collecting information about you, you should be able to say, what information do you have, so that I can, know that you're doing it the way you're doing it, and you're not sending it off to somebody for some other purpose. But it's now evolved into something else. Definitely an industry. We hear from some of those aggregators and some of those brokerage houses about how much information they get from public records and public records requests. So all balancing it out. Not meaning to depress anybody, but there you are.
But have you seen the new iPhone?
Comment?
It's so cool.
Yeah, Camille?
Oh yeah, I just want to come back to the, I know you're going to ask me, but I'm going to go ahead of it and kind of go back to the surveillance ordinance. One thing that I find really confusing is the way in which the exclusion list works with the inclusion list, especially around two items on the exclusion list. So what we can't have a review on are body-worn cameras, body-worn cameras, and cameras installed in or on a police vehicle. So that's excluded.
Why is
But-
that? She says.
Yeah, why is that?
What's that about?
Especially considering the inclusion criteria below about the
Yep.
technology. If it's included if the technology disparately impacts disadvantaged groups, and the second one, the technology raises reasonable concerns about impacts to civil liberty, freedom of speech or association, racial equity or social justice that we were talking about earlier. So I'm reading this and it's very incongruous and I don't understand. And yeah, Jennifer, if you have.
We could talk over beverages for hours about aspects of this law that seem at odds. I wasn't involved in writing this one, so I can't say I was there, but I do understand. Imagine a room like this with probably about this many people all having an opinion and trying to make sure their interests are heard and make sure we move forward on this, and real voices having issues. One of the things that came out of this, there are some technologies that are being governed in different ways. So body-worn cameras have a whole different set of policy and I don't know if they're under ordinance, but I know there are strict policies that also have private consent decrees involved and other judicial oversight, as well as camera vehicles, vehicle cameras for police, and that those have an additional set of oversight involved with them. Now, my concern from the beginning with body-worn is what we all were looking for, I think, was the bird's eye view of what's happening between two individuals when we have a question about whether excessive force, et cetera, was used. It's actually facing this way. You may get some of what is happening back here, but for the most part, it's an outward-facing camera. You're picking up all the additional information. However, those two technologies were exempted because there are other very stringent rules and regulations about how they're used, and the oversight involved is even more than the surveillance ordinance. So they were evaluated and are in place separate from and even more stringently monitored than these. And then the additional exemptions were things like security cameras that are stationary or cameras that are on critical infrastructure like bridges or dams, that those need to be in place. So that's kind of the reason that those are exempted, as I understand it. Now, interestingly, whenever we have public engagement, we have nice people like you come to talk to us about these things. Those are the technologies everybody wants to talk about in relationship to surveillance, and we have to say those aren't really under consideration. But I can talk to you about some binoculars. There are different technologies that were not addressed separately or brought into the city with any other stringency.
Yeah, I think one really powerful part of the surveillance ordinance is the public comment period. And that's kind of how I got involved, just even a little bit. And just having that like public interface is really powerful because it's like public record. And so I think not having that for those technologies seemed kind of like it didn't really engender a lot of trust. So I wonder if that has happened before and I was just not aware of it, but yeah.
So body-worn was handled separately. When the body-worn cameras went in place, for those who don't know, that was a mayoral directive under our several ago mayors, and it was, we will bring these in. But what they did do is they did something like 30 to 40 public engagement meetings just about body-worn cameras and the concerns about those, to the point where it could be a full-time every job for several people in the police force, but they did a lot of outreach about that one. Cameras on vehicles, I don't think had the same outreach. I think if you have an opportunity, we'll have more public engagement about surveillance technologies coming into the new year, well, the end of this year and into the new year, and I really strongly advise, you can talk about anything. Police will show up to those, you can talk about any of the issues that are of concern. Usually we're highlighting a couple of technologies that are under review, but it's a good conversation to have if you have concerns, so.
Yeah, actually, I definitely think you're right to point out that there's something a little disconcerting about that exemption. Ginger's correct, of course, that there was another process that took place that is regulating, to a certain extent, how body-worn cameras can operate. But one missed opportunity that I see by not including them on our surveillance ordinance, and I should point out that body-worn cameras are included on surveillance ordinances in many other jurisdictions, but just not ours. One of the key features of our surveillance ordinance, which is very powerful, is the annual surveillance usage review, in which every item that is approved for use in the city has to be reviewed every year and evaluated not only for its effectiveness, but also to understand whether or not it has any new features have been added, any new capabilities that might not have been subject to the original review, but also reviewed for its effects on civil rights and civil liberties, to continue asking the question that the whereas statement that was concerned with issues of discrimination and oppression we're trying to ask is we've been using, so that we should be able to say we've been using body-worn cameras for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and this year we really started to notice a particular problem that we are uncomfortable with as a society, and we don't have that opportunity under the way that body-worn cameras are currently regulated because they're not in this particular ordinance. I should also point out another notable exception to this ordinance, which is that surveillance data that comes from other agencies is not covered by this ordinance. So surveillance conducted by, say, the state police or by federal authorities can still be used by the city of Seattle. They're just not as, I'm sure Ginger will correct me if I'm mistaken about that. And there's also no particular prohibition on, well, I'll just leave it at that. But it's not the only exemption. And there's a lot to be learned from comparing this regulation with the other very strong surveillance ordinance in the country, which is the one out of Oakland, to see where there are interesting differences. Yeah.
I think the reason data wasn't included is that you could construe just about anything that the city collects as surveillance, if you consider how much data is collected voluntarily and maybe through enforcement that happens in various areas, from traffic enforcement to police. And I think the idea was, let's start with technology. Let's start with technology specifically designed and implemented for surveillance. I can't say this is my ideal legislation. It's been cumbersome. It's taken 2 years. We did, however, get 2 of these SIRs voted on, I don't know if you know this, yesterday, Monday, in full council. So 2 of these laws have actually gone into place with enforceable policies as a part of them. Yes, thank you. It took 2 years to get these through. Many amendments, changes, rewrites. Not everybody's happy still. So I think this is an evolving, ongoing thing. And I think as our new city council comes in place, there'll be fresh eyes on this and an opportunity for the public to provide their feedback about what's working for them and what isn't. And please come, show up, have your opinion heard. I think it's good.
So the final question is for Camille. You are a member of the community who's found a way to get engaged and actively participate in these kinds of conversations. I would like to know how you started that journey and what advice you may have for other people who, like yourself, may be out in the audience and looking for ways to get involved.
Yeah, so I want to kind of iterate first what you were saying earlier of just just reading and being informed and doing your due diligence. I think that was really the first step to really questioning, oh, if I use Instagram, where is this data going to go? And then it just kind of ballparked into this whole concern that I have. And then when I was so frustrated about it, I Googled Seattle technology, and I came upon CTAB. And I'm very privileged to be able to go to CTAB meetings, and I have the time to go to CTAB meetings, which are once a month, Tuesdays from 6 to 8. There you go. I was particularly concerned about privacy, and so I joined the privacy subcommittee that also meets on Tuesdays, on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, also around that same time. And so I just showed up, and just really showing up, as we all know, is just really the biggest first thing. I got involved in the surveillance ordinance and did research on the various Group 2 technologies, and I'm really excited about Group 3 whenever that comes up, so I'll probably get involved in that as well. And I also tried to find other resources around the community, and so I know that the University of Washington has a great technology policy lab, and I'm on their distribution list, and just getting informed that way, and how academics kind of have these perspectives is really good. And so I know that they have events that the public are allowed. I've been to a few. There's one in October. And yeah, I think those are like the main ways that I get involved, and being part of like elections, voting is really important. And so those are kind of the main ways that I get engaged with privacy. Yeah.
I think that's great. And if you're interested at the federal level, Representative Del Bene and Senator Cantwell both have privacy legislation they've been working on for quite a while. There might be a way to connect in at the federal level and see what we can do there. I think there's also going to be state action when that session opens up very soon. Maybe a couple more months. January? Yeah. January. They'll be working on legislation at that level too, and there might be ways to connect or at least be aware of what's going on at the state level. That's great.
Great. Are there any final thoughts that you have to your fellow panelists, or just statements you would like to make?
I read a great article recently that the information we give up in social media is more than, and this is a dated reference, than the KGB ever got out of people under duress. And I think it's important to recognize that Mark Zuckerberg does not care about your social interactions. He doesn't care that grandma gets all the pictures. He doesn't care that you're reaching out to your high school friends. None of this matters. He is gathering incredible amounts of information. We're giving it up without thought. And we're giving up our social interactions to folks that isn't really the business they're in. So I would just really recommend that folks think about those things. That may be a very important connection for you, but be thoughtful about what you're sharing, be thoughtful about engaging in some of those activities. They are thinking up there in Silicon Valley now, thinking of all the new ways to get information out of you, and I think it behooves us all to be thoughtful. So
Yeah, I think I just want to dovetail on that, we spend a lot of time thinking about how state actors use technology, surveillance technology, and a lot of there's been concerns, of course, about the NSA and ICE and the way they're using technology. And there's no question that the government's use of technology in our lives is incredibly impactful and incredibly serious. But at the end of the day, based on the most optimistic reading of our Constitution, we live in a democratic society in which we, in theory, have a say about how that work continues, how that work goes. And so, as Ginger pointed out, getting involved and speaking up and writing to legislators actually does make a difference. It actually does matter. But the more serious issue, I think, confronting us now is that now we have a private sector that has more data collection and gathering and surveillance capabilities than any government in the world. And this is unique. This is a remarkable moment in which a handful of large corporations have incredible insight into our daily lives and the minutia of our existences. And so, like in anything, as a consumer, buyer needs to be aware. You need to try to arm yourself with as much understanding as you can, and be really, really skeptical about the words that come out of the mouths of technology leaders, no matter how cool they seem, right? Mm-hmm. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, people next, Jack from Twitter, whoever, like anybody coming down the line, with the next great thing. Like when they use words like community, ask yourself the question, whose community are we talking about, right? Like whose happiness when they use words like freedom, whose freedom are they talking about, right? Whose prosperity are they really addressing in their work?
I would say, just to add on to that, as far as it pertains to the private sector, I do personally believe that the consumer has a lot of power there. If the consumer can start educating and becoming aware of the practices that are happening in the private sector, the consumer can start affecting that bottom line. And at the end of the day, that's the driver for change for these companies. So.
I have two interrelated questions for Ginger, and I will keep them concise. The first is that, this is just my understanding of it, but Europe's GDPR applies to not just government technologies, but actually most of it applies to private companies operating in their physical location. Would Seattle ever consider legislation that covers the operation of private entities in addition to government? Mm-hmm. And then the next interrelated question is, say you download an app, you look at the privacy controls, you don't like what you see, however, you have to use the app for work or for school, or given the decline in antitrust activity in this country, like we don't have a lot of consumer choice, especially in the tech sector. So if you're unhappy with the way that a company is handling your data, who can you contact? Would it be the state attorney general? Is there someone else or some other form of advocacy that you recommend that you think would be most effective?
Wow. Okay.
Sorry, maybe
Let's
it wasn't
do the
that
first
brief.
one
I'm
first.
sorry.
It remains to be seen if Seattle has interest in private sector controls and private sector privacy. We've concentrated on government because that's what we can control right now. I can make commitments to you and do my darndest to make them follow through, and then we can be transparent. You can see if I'm doing that. I have a feeling that the more local you are, the harder it is to get large corporations to comply. On the other hand, large corporations are already complying with GDPR. So it may be that we are getting more of the local companies that know they have to operate under certain terms if we have local privacy legislation in place. So I think it remains to be seen. We do have a mayor who's very interested in consumer privacy. She herself has been victimized by a variety of activities or more around malicious intent, but I think that she has stated her interests in this area of privacy. So now that the budget's behind her and she has her feet under her now after the first year, we'll see if that becomes something that's of interest to her. I do think that the state is a little farther along on some of this, so that's something to watch. Interesting, I just want to make a comment about GDPR that it is more focused on consumer. Europe has this idea that you have the right to disappear on the consumer side, but they give a lot of information to government. We're kind of the opposite. We're more concerned about what government does and have not regulated the consumer side. Just an interesting flip. So when you consider GDPR, it's something that corporations are very freaked out about here, but I do know the large companies that you do interaction with mostly have adopted GDPR as a standard around the world, that they just can't live with two different systems. In terms of if you're not happy with app controls, well, the best thing is don't use the app. If you don't have a choice to do that because for some other reason you're forced to do it, lock down as much as you can. And if you do feel you're being victimized or you feel you have a complaint, I think I mentioned that Representative Del Bene, Senator Cantwell, and it's State Senator Carlisle, and I can't remember the other one, Jessup, I want to say, I don't think that's right. But the two folks have been involved with the consumer law at the Washington state level. Would love to hear from folks who gives them the justification they need to continue to pursue privacy laws. So I guess that's what I would say. There's not a lot of power you have except in I'm not going to play. Okay. And maybe find an alternative if you can't, and letting the company know. If you have a company or a school, I had to do social media at the University of Washington when I was getting my master's, and I was very unhappy about that. What was ironic is I jumped off Facebook. They made me jump back on because I was in a program where we had to communicate with each other. All of my old contacts came back. They never deleted anything. I know they didn't. So yeah, some of it's pretty nefarious, but if you see activity that you really think is victimizing, then I do think our state attorney general, who is in support of laws that we are trying to do at the state level, would be interested.
Great, thank you. And this was an awesome panel, so thank you for organizing it.
Yeah, this is a good discussion. It was talked about earlier how people are willing to give up their privacy, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because they feel these immediate sort of conveniences, or they get immediate value. And I think it's clear that there are also consequences, but they're not as immediate. They're not as felt. I bet there's lots of studies either being done or that have been done that look at real measurable consequences in aggregate, like across populations or communities, but people act in their own interest, not in the interest of often a larger community or population. So what are ways that people should start thinking about or will eventually feel more of those consequences of giving up privacy in a more personal way?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer that question. That's a tough one. I mean, at the end of the day, unless I get arrested for what I posted on social media, it's going to be hard for me to really feel that. That being said, the line of research that's personally important to me is understanding how the same technologies that are being used for, say, targeted advertising, right, in which we know where you've been, we know what you've bought, we know what kind of movies you watch. We know all these various details about you. We know we've accessed your public records. We know your family composition, and so on. So we can send you ads for sneakers or for eyeglasses or whatever. That same technology is being used increasingly for a whole range of products for things like employment recruiting apps. Right? So for a lot of people applying for jobs, particularly especially at large corporations, HR managers are being sold these products that are designed to winnow down the gigantic pile of resumes. And how do they do that? Well, they do a number of processes of using AI to read through resumes, looking for keywords and so on. But once they find a handful of candidates, there's a whole range, hundreds of systems exist, products exist, that go out and mine social media data, use the same data stores that target advertisers use to identify people and profile them, to render verdicts on people. And they're being used by employers, being used by landlords, they're being used in courtrooms for risk assessment there. And it's most likely the way people are going to feel these things is as these products and services expand out and touch more areas of our lives. So we don't really have much control over making people more aware of this, except by talking to our friends and families. But it looks like the industry is pushing deeper and deeper into our lives, and we're going to start feeling the effects of these things in a more immediate way, I think, very soon.
I'll just chime in there. That just got me thinking. I think, Ginger, you were mentioning these one-off data points, oh, it doesn't really matter so much if somebody knows where I am this day, or I turn on my location. But if you think about data brokers, and I'll use Axiom as an example, they're claimed to have like 1,500 data points on about 10% of the world's population. So that means like data points from sexual orientation to browsing history to medical records to political affiliations. There's 1,500 data points on or 10% of the world population on this one data broker. And that makes me think there's this great, I think you and I were talking about it, Torgie, documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack. And it really talks about Cambridge Analytica and the impact of what those data sets really truly mean and what that data can influence. So I think it goes back to, it's not really in your face of an impact, but if you take a pause and just kind of take a bird's eye view at what's happening, I think the data is incredibly powerful. So.
I think we have right now we have an example of some stories that have come out of China about their social scoring. They're using all these information to do social scoring, containing people's or restricting people's ability to travel. If you're in a low social score, you're not a trusted citizen, therefore we're not going to let you travel, or you're going to travel to lower class. This is abhorrent to us, right? But I think that the kind of data that's being collected could lead to something like that, where we start to, and certainly HR decisions and whether or not you're going to get a credit score that can result in, we had a contest at the city of Seattle that worried me because I think the precedent it was going to set. It was a Department of Transportation initiative for the best of intentions. We want to limit the number of accidents people have. It was the safest driver contest. It was fabulous. It collected all the information on your phone, this app that was going to look at whether you were cornering quickly or stopping too much, and somebody got $2,500 for making the best score, and all I could think is PEMCO and Google were the sponsors of that app, right? So all I could think is that was a foray, right, into probably some kind of insurance scoring that was going to decide whether or not you're in an accident, how prone you might be. So I think we're really good at the scare stories, sorry, but I think those are things to be aware of, that every little bit of information that's collected out there could have a purpose, and so that's why you want to be mindful. It's not saying you don't sign up for that contest. $2,500 is $2,500, but I believe we want to be aware when we do that. You know, what's being advertised is, gee, this great thing. There might be other reasons why companies want that information.
Yeah, just one more comment about that. I really urge you to support tech journalism, right? So if you're not currently a paying subscriber to a publication like The Guardian, which has an excellent technology section, or The Washington Post, which has excellent technology coverage, or even any smaller publications, or even some of the better blogs out there. There's a lot of great information that comes through people whose job it is to look for the smoking gun and to interpret it. And I've read some of my education comes from outstanding tech journalism that I've read about these issues, and so that I feel it more than I might have otherwise.
One last comment. People tend to relate to their vulnerable relatives' information being collected more than themselves. So the one person I mentioned to you goes, "Oh, Ginger, it's over." When I said, "What about your kids?" She went, "Oh." So sometimes that's the story that can get through to people. Would you want your grandma's information? Would you want your elderly relative? Would you want your younger relatives' information collected without them knowing and used for purposes that may harm them in the future?
Hi, my name is Janice Tefty. I used to be active with CTAB. I'm just traveling too much and haven't been as much. I do attend other meetings when I'm able to. What I wanted to say is, first of all, I had to laugh that this was promoted on Facebook, and I sent it to a few of my friends. I'm like, look at this. Anyway, because I'm involved with health systems improvement nationally and locally. I'm also involved. So I actually suggested that we should have something on health tech in the future, because a big issue, what you've discussed here, and you just mentioned, Ginger, about private, the big thing now in health is social determinants of health, which means everything other than your clinician visit or your nurse visit. So when you go to the grocery store, QFC, or whoever, Safeway, and buy something, and that's data. When you get on the bus, that's data. Almost anywhere you go, there's data. Your phone is tracking you, what you're doing, where you work. And reality is somebody is capturing that, and they're aware of what we're doing and where we're at, and we're being judged somewhere on a risk factor of where our health is and how insurance companies. So it's a huge field, and it's totally a wild west, and give me my damn data is the big cry among us e-patients, but there's a huge other side to that. So I'm just curious if anybody has any input there. Quick.
I mean, I have a thought about that, which it corresponds with the question of research ethics in this field. So I just yesterday or the day before was reading about a new application in which they were going to be using data about like how people use their keyboards, and then and collecting data from social media sites. I can't even remember what it was, but it had to do with providing information to clinicians. The whole idea was constructing this sort of information gathering infrastructure of people's everyday technology uses to tell stories for clinicians to better understand the health of their patients, right? And it's being sold, of course, as something like, how can you deny healthcare professionals access to information that that they could use to help their patients? But it raises a lot of red flags, because we see a lot of this kind of research happening in which it seems like no one has stepped back to ask the question, well, what will the bad actor do with this? And whichever technology this was, I mean, the first thing I thought was, yeah, the small number of clinicians who will use this to help a small number of patients will be completely outgunned by the bad actors who will use it to sell snake oil and products to folks. And it's not just, and the thing is that there's a great deal of sympathy or warm feelings about health data, in the same way that there's a great deal of sympathy and warm feelings about when the police are able to reunite a child with their parent using facial recognition technology, for example, right? And these messages are used to sell us on the idea that these technologies have so much goodness potential in them that we shouldn't question the dark side. But I would suggest that we actually always have to question and push very hard on the question of how can this be misused, and we should assume that it will be misused.
Everything Fitbit, you name it. Anyway, yeah, it's true.
And all the ancestry, just be
yes.
mindful of all your DNA. Just talks, and we don't even know everything it can tell us yet, but once that information is provided to those folks, it's out there.
So huge shout out to these 4 great panelists. Thank you.